Thank you for joining us today for PMBA's Toolkit Community Service Grant 101. My name is John Chen, and I'm PMBA's Managing Director. And I'd like to take just a moment to introduce Kate Arno and Andrew Charnik. Kate Arno is Director, TV, CSG Policy and Review, and Andrew is the Director, Radio, CSG Policy and Administration, both for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Kate joined CPB in January 2013 as Director of Community Service, TV Community Service Grant Policy and Review. Previously, she was the Senior Policy Associate at the University of Southern Maryland, where she directed a national initiative that collected, cleaned, and analyzed data on the activities of almost 5,000 U.S. Department of Justice grant recipients. Kate previously enjoyed 9 years at Maine Public Broadcasting, where she was Vice President of Television and Education. She is an Emmy Award-winning television producer and has an undergraduate degree in journalism and a master's in public policy and management. Kate also serves on PMBA's Board of Directors as a representative for the CPB. Andrew is Director, Radio, CSG Policy and Administration, where he oversees the financial reporting of nearly 600 grantees in the CSG program. Andrew joined CPB staff in 2011 as a Manager of Business Planning and Operations in the Office of the COO. Prior to CPB, Andrew was an independent consultant for early-stage businesses and entrepreneurs. He also worked domestically and internationally in asset management and private banking with J.P. Morgan Chase & Company and with the Walt Disney Company. Andrew earned a BA with distinction in chemistry from the University of Delaware and an MBA from the Stephen M. Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. And just a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. This session is being recorded, but all participants are automatically muted. At any point, should you have a question for either of our panelists, please use the chat box, and we will refer to all the questions at the end of the program. If you have technical questions or problems or can't see the screen, please email us at info@pmbaonline.org. After the session, all participants will receive an evaluation and link to download the PowerPoint slides. This session does qualify you for CPE credit. In order to receive credit, you must stay on for the full duration of the call. Throughout the webinar, there will be 3 polling questions. In order to obtain CPE credit, you must answer and respond to all questions. CPE credit may be denied or reduced if the participant does not respond to all polling questions. Upon completion, you must complete the evaluation that PMBA sends you. Approximately 2 weeks after the webinar, PMBA will send you your CPE certificate. And now I'd like to introduce you to Kate and Andrew.
Hey, thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here. We're going to do our presentation in 2 parts today. I'm going to begin by giving us an overview of the CSG program. Then we're going to concentrate on some specifics that pertain to the television program, and Andrew is going to talk about some specifics that pertain to the radio program. And when you're done, we trust that you'll have a deeper understanding of CPB's community service grants, the type of grants that CPB offers, the eligibility requirements, and how they're calculated. As John said, there are 3 questions involved in the webinar today, and one of them pertains to who is in our audience. What type of licensee is your station affiliated with? So when that question comes up, we'll be anxious to get your answers, get a better idea of who's in the audience today. So let's start with a look at the system. Today, there are about 600 CSG grantees operating more than 1,400 stations, and that number refers to transmitters here. On the next slide, we see that of 170 TV CSG recipients, most are community licensees, but about a third are university licensees, and then fewer are licensed to state and local authorities. On the next slide, of the 407 radio CSG eligible stations in the system, most are university licensees, followed by community licensees, again with fewer state and local authority licensees. Now the next slide takes a look at CPB's money tree. I've constructed this tree with no interest or carry forward dollars. The tree represents one thing: how the basic annual appropriation is apportioned within the buckets or categories of spending at CPB. This distribution is locked in federal statute. This year's appropriation amount reflects the advanced appropriation of $445 million, less a rescission of 0.2180%. So we begin with the top box, that's the full appropriation, and you'll see that it immediately is broken into two categories: the 6% that's set aside for system support on the left, and on the right, no more than 5% set aside for CPB operations. The remainder comes down through the middle, 89% to station and programming grants, and then that is apportioned 75% to television and 25% to radio, and the funds go into either the CSG grants or programming grants. And again, this is apportioned according to federal statute, so we have no flexibility with that. On the next slide, just a look at our CSG cycle. For FY 2017, the one we're already in now, because we're already receiving annual financial reports from stations whose fiscal years end July or June 30th. So grantees will be submitting financial data by May 31st, unless of course they do apply for a waiver. CPB calculates and offers the CSG grants for 2017 in late October of next year, and then we certify, and grantees certify and accept the CSG. The first payment becomes available. The second payment becomes available after grantees submit their SAS or SABs, and we'll talk more about what those reports are later, and their local content and service report, the LCSR, and also their financial data for FY 2016. And the second payment is distributed, and it starts all over again. So we're in a continuous cycle of grant making. Now the next few slides I'm going to go through rather quickly because they just pertain to the eligibility criteria. Before we talk about the specifics of the community service grants themselves, we just thought we'd walk through very quickly what the criteria are that enable a station to be eligible for a CSG award. And of course, first and foremost, they must have a nonprofit FCC license. And new this year, for television stations and channel sharing agreements that might come about after the spectrum auction, the TV channels must have at least access to half of the channel capacity. There's a staffing requirement for TV. The station must be managed by an executive. For radio, there's 1.5 employees whose salary is not paid by the CSG or community service grant dollars. On the next slide, we see that there are programming requirements to air CPB qualified programming, and there's a specific minimum broadcast schedule for both TV and radio that you see there, 58 hours a week, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year for TV, and 18 consecutive hours a day, every week for radio. The next slide shows eligibility requirements pertaining to the Communications Act. Notices for open meetings and closed meetings must be posted. Most stations are required to have a community advisory board. They must meet specific EEO requirements, donor policy requirements, and an open financial records requirements. We won't go into a lot of detail or any detail on these today, but suffice it to say the Communications Act imposes at least 5 requirements of its own. On the next slide, we see that CSG grantees are also required to develop a diversity policy and annual goals. They must abide by certain transparency requirements that are intended to signal accountability to stakeholders, and there are a number of items that a station must post to its website. And then there are several reports, the SAS and SABs, we'll talk more about those shortly, local content and services report, all of that due annually by February 15th. And finally, on the next slide, both radio and TV have minimum non-federal financial support requirements, and this slide pertains only to TV. Andrew's going to talk about radio a little bit later. But of course, as you know, NFFS is defined as qualifying direct, indirect, and in-kind revenue from sources not federal government. And this is important because NFFS determines the incentive portion of the CSG award. And for TV stations, the minimum is $800,000, and that's calculated on a 3-year average. For the CSG just awarded, we calculated NFFS based on FY 2012, 13, and 14. Okay, so now we have another question for you, and since we've talked a little bit about the eligibility requirements and NFFS, we're interested in knowing if you who are attending the workshop today have a role in tracking your station's compliance to grant terms and eligibility criteria. Look forward to hearing from you with your answers on that. We'll move ahead, though, with our focus on the television CSG program in the next few slides, and then Andrew will join us for radio. In the next slide, we see that the community service grants are divided into 3 parts. So if I could have the next slide, please. We have a base grant, which is a fixed amount, an incentive grant, which matches a qualifying station's NFFS, and a special grant for a particular class of stations. So those are the 3 basic categories of grants, and actually they work both for TV and radio. In the next slide, we'll talk about the standard base grant for TV. This equals 0.11% of the federal appropriation. So for FY 2016, the base grant was $488,468. Now for television, unlike radio, not every station gets a full base grant. This year, 130 stations received a full base grant, but stations in multi-provider markets actually share a base grant. So 39 stations shared base grants. And then 1 station with a 3-year average NFFS above $55 million did not receive a base grant, and that's per CSG policy. On the next slide, we look at the incentive grant. So we've talked about the base grant, now the incentive grant. This is the piece that motivates stations to generate NFFS, and it's calculated on a station's NFFS, and in FY 2016, for each NFFS dollar reported and approved by CPB, reported by the station, approved by CPB, a TV grantee received approximately 13 cents. And we'll be talking a little bit more about how that's calculated later. First, let's walk through the special or supplemental grants and incentives that are part of the CSG program. We begin on the next slide with small station support, and we have 2 grants, CSG grants, on the next slide that pertain to small station support, the local service grant and the small station bonus. Both are aimed at stations that report NFFS of less than $2 million. But the local service grant has an additional criteria. Your coverage area population must be 2.5 million or less. And in that case, a $3 million pool is distributed inversely by a station's NFFS. So the smaller your NFFS, the larger your local service grant. So in FY 2016, 45 stations received local service grants that ranged from $26,000 to almost $220,000. The small station bonus, on the other hand, uses a pool of funds that is derived from what would have been base grants for stations with NFFS above $55 million. And then that base grant is divided equally among all the qualifying small stations. So in FY 16, there was only one station that didn't receive a full base grant for this reason, and it happened to be in a multi-provider market. So 47 stations received a bonus of just over $5,000 from a pool that was about $250,000. The next thing we're going to talk about is the program differentiation incentive. Only secondary stations in multi-provider markets are eligible, and stations must certify that their programming schedule is differentiated from the other stations in the market. So in a PDI or a multi-provider market, remember there are 17. In 15, stations qualify for these incentives. And it's only the stations who don't have the largest NFFS. Those are known as the secondary stations. So in FY 2016, 21 stations in 15 multi-provider markets received a total of just over $4 million. Remember, these stations have to certify that no programs on their primary channels, with the exception of children's or certain news programming, play on the same day on any other station in their market. In the next slide, we take a look at the distance service program, and this really is intended to provide additional help to state networks if for stations operating 3 or more transmitters. It's tied to the base grant, so it does fluctuate with each appropriation. This year, over $5 million was distributed to 39 stations through distance service grants. And you can see that it's calculated on the number of transmitters. So a station with 3 transmitters is eligible for an additional CSG amount equal to 5% of its standard base grant. And it goes all the way up to 12 transmitters that qualifies for an increase worth 80% of its base grant. On the next slide, we'll just take a look very quickly at the TV Merger and Collaboration Grant Program. And we won't spend a lot of time here, but these funds are held in reserve based and stations qualify for them based on a very specific formula that's been approved by the CPB board. Unused funds are rolled into subsequent CSG grant pools in the next year. So these funds are currently, some of these funds are set to expire at the end of this year, and the TV CSG review panel is actually examining now the continued need for merger and consolidation funds. But if you go to the far left here on our slide, you see initial discussions. CPB provides no funding for initial discussions, but it provides funding for planning, if we go to the step to the right, and then the next step to the right, implementation, and then finally fully executed mergers or collaborations. So this slide alone is worth about half an hour of discussion. Suffice it to say, it is a CSG set-aside program that certain stations can qualify for based on a specific formula. The next slide talks about the CSG Advance. A pool of funds is also, in this case, set aside for stations experiencing financial difficulty. So stations qualify for these funds, which is really an advance. It must be paid back. based on very specific criteria. We've only since 2009 when the advance was created, and remember at the time that was in the middle of quite a downturned economy, we've only had 2 stations take advantage of the program. So those are our special programs, and now the next 2 slides will complete our television CSG overview by talking a little bit about the calculation. Let's look at this slide from the top down. First, I talked earlier about the base grant being calculated as 0.11% of the federal appropriation. So for FY 2016, the base grant is $488,468. That's with the rescission. In the next cell down, we take a look at the total CSG pool for FY 16, and this includes a carry forward of $12 million, which is comprised of interest. It's comprised of unspent funds, maybe in those set-aside grant programs that didn't get expended. So it gave us a pool of over $234 million. The first thing that happens from that pool is that CPB sets aside the CSG advance and the pool and the reserve for the merger and collaborations that we just talked about. So for FY 2016, that's just over $7,000. And then it computes the base grant and the small station bonus, in this case, almost $72 million. And then we compute the distance service grant, in this case, this year, over $5 million. And finally, the local service grant of using a pool of $3 million. What remains is the incentive funds pool. So this was well over $147 million this year. And this is what gets distributed on the basis of the NFFS that stations report. So if we go to the next slide, we see the incentive grant calculation. And that is derived by using the incentive rate of return. So if you look at the far left of the slide, the incentive rate of return is derived by taking the incentive funds pool that we just identified and dividing it by the total FY14 NFFS. So for this year, we had over $147 million in the incentive funds pool. You see there we had $1 billion in NFFS, and so the incentive rate of return is approximately 13 cents, and we carry it out to 10 decimal places there for accuracy, but the bottom line is it means that stations earn about 13 extra cents for every dollar of NFFS that's reported and approved. Now with that, we have our television section done, and we're ready to begin looking at the radio CSG program with Andrew Charnik.
Thank you, Kate, and good afternoon, everyone. Today, I'll be speaking about the radio CSG program. There are over 400 qualifying radio grantees in the CSG program for 2016. All of the operational, statutory, and reporting requirements stations must meet to gain and maintain CSG eligibility are outlined in the radio general provisions and eligibility criteria. This document, as well as other useful documents, can be found on cpb.org, and Kate has reviewed a substantial portion of these already. The radio CSG program is similar in many ways to the television CSG program, as CPB has consciously tried to align the two programs where it made sense to do so. However, there are a few meaningful differences, which I'll explain in much more detail in this part of the presentation. Next slide, please. Today I will focus on a few important financial and service requirements unique to radio grantees, specifically the NFFS minimum and the audience service criteria. For the fiscal year 2017, the requirements I'm presenting are for stations currently in the CSG program. Now, unlike the TV program, the radio program at the moment is an open program. Stations that are applying for the CSG program must meet fully phased-in requirements, which are slightly higher than what's listed here. That would be 300,000 in NFFS and 2 full-time employees. This is equivalent to what will be required of all CSG grantees in fiscal year 2018. In the next slide, this is an outline of your minimum NFFS requirements. As you know, radio stations are assigned their CSG level by CPB on an annual basis. And these listed here are the current minimum requirements for each level, and these range from 0 to 400,000 depending on your level. These minimums are being increased for 2017 and 2018, and these changes were approved in April 2013 by the CPP board after a year-long system consultation. This chart shows the 2-year phase-in by CSG level. We'll talk a bit more about levels shortly. So for level A or sole service stations, these are stations that are the only broadcast service, radio or TV, commercial or non-commercial, within a 50-mile radius of the transmitter. This is a very rare designation. In fact, there are only a dozen in the system, and most of those are located in Alaska. They're very remote services, and they do not have an NFFS minimum. Now, stations that are both rural and minority, this is the second line, they have a $100,000 minimum, given the extraordinary environments in which they operate. The level B minimum on the third line is $225,000, level C $275,000, and level D $400,000. Again, these are for the 2017 grant year. Now, please understand also, if we could head back one slide, go back to the previous slide here for a moment. Just understand that the years represented on the chart are CSG grant years. In the last row there, the grant eligibility is based on financial reporting from these years. So, for example, for the CSG 2017, your requirement must be fulfilled in your fiscal year 2015. As part of the NFFS requirements, some portion of the minimum must be raised as cash or direct revenue, not in-kind contributions or indirect administrative support. This requirement is listed as a percentage of your station's NFFS minimum. For example, if your NFFS minimum is $225,000 in 2017, 25% would be $56,250, which must be earned as direct revenue, and this will be 50% in 2018. The minimum staffing level is 1.5 full-time employee for 2017 and 2 for 2018. Now, one important thing to note, as I mentioned earlier, the radio CSG is an open program. The application period is typically in late spring, early summer. Now, in terms of not meeting your minimum NFFS requirement, there's a glide path out of the CSG program if you're unable to consistently meet the minimums. For example, a station that fails to meet the minimum in FY16 and 17 will be removed from the program if they also fail to meet the minimum in fiscal year 18. So this concludes our discussion of the non-federal financial support criteria for radio grantees. We'll now focus on audience service criteria. So audience service criteria is a measurement of service by and local support for public radio stations. Stations need only meet one of these 2 indices, but they have to meet at least one, and that's either the listening index or the community financial support index. The listening index uses an average of 2 spring Nielsen audiobooks, and the community financial support index is based on a grantee's reported direct revenue from such sources as membership, underwriting, and major donors. And indirect or in-kind support does not count in this formula. So these formula indicate performance relative to a station's coverage area population. They may look intimidating in terms of a formula, but they're meant to give you a whole number that you can use in the next slide. So this next slide shows the ASC goals that grantees must meet for both indices, listening and community financial support. Note that on the left, you'll see your coverage area population. Depending on your population, you'll have different requirements. And also notice that there is a breakout between news and non-news stations. CPB reviews these measures annually, but I would encourage stations to do the math themselves to gauge their own performance. We use it as a minimum requirement, but stations can use this as part of their management tool set. In the next slide, similar to NFFS, there is also a program removal process for stations that continually do not meet the audience service criteria. Stations are given several years to improve their performance before they are removed. The first 2 years, affected grantees are required to spend 25% of their unrestricted grant on activities designed to increase either their audience or their community financial support, or both. We also send notices to stations that have not failed the minimum but are within 10% of missing their goal to hopefully get stations to focus on increasing their performance. So we've discussed NFFS and your ASC criteria. Now we'll talk about some special designations within the radio program. These designations are important in that they provide such stations with additional funding. The first is Minority Audience Service Stations, or MAS stations. These are stations that meet one of these criteria. Either station's minority audience cum composition is 45% or greater, they're licensed to an historically black college or university, or they're licensed to a Native American tribe, or is otherwise tribally controlled. In the next slide, we'll see that there is specific support related to this designation. They receive additional funding in the program. The base grants are multiplied by 1.5, and for eligible grantees, that is for level C and D, their NFFS is multiplied by 1.5 prior to applying the incentive rate of return to calculate their incentive grant portion. We'll talk about that more in just a moment. The next special designation is for Rural Audience Service Stations, or RAS stations. Stations are considered rural if they meet the definition of the coverage area population density less than or equal to 40 people per square kilometer. RAS stations eligible for incentive grants have their NFFS multiplied by 1.25 before the grant is calculated. Now, if stations are both rural and minority, they receive both related multipliers and have the NFFS multiplied by a total of 1.75. Now, we've talked about program minimums and some special designations. Now, let's talk about the program structure. To determine individual grant amounts for stations, the CPB first determines in which one of 4 levels the station belongs each year. I mentioned these earlier. Level A is sole service stations. B, these are smaller stations. They can be rural or non-rural. They have NFFS under $275,000, and they have fewer than 4 full-time employees. Level C and D both have more than 4 or more full-time employees. Level C are larger rural stations. Level D are non-rural stations, and their NFFS is greater. For level C, it's greater than $275,000. For level D, it's greater than $400,000. As in television, the radio CSGs consist of base grants, incentive grants, and special grants. Not all stations receive all grants, but every station receives a base grant based on their level. So here are the base grants that we distributed for FY16. Base grants are tied to the appropriation. If the appropriation goes up, the base grant amounts go up, and likewise, if it goes down, the base grant amounts go down. And as I mentioned previously, mass or minority audience service stations have their base grants multiplied by 1.5. In addition to base grants, level C and D grantees receive incentive grants. You'll see this on the next slide. And this is based on the amount of NFFS that they've raised. Their adjusted NFFS is multiplied by the calculated incentive rate of return. You can see this on the next slide. You'll see that only level C and D receive incentive grants, and both mass and RAS, or minority and rural grantees, can have adjusted NFFS. In fiscal year 2016, eligible stations received about 5.8 cents for every dollar of NFFS earned. In the next slide, we'll see that there is currently one special grant in the radio CSG program, and this is the Rural Support Grant, or RSG. The RSG is support for rural services provided by almost 40% of radio grantees. There is a designated pool of funds for the RSGs, and this is divided among the rural grantees each year. Mass stations receive a grant amount that is 1.5 times the one received by non-mass stations, consistent with mass treatment across the CSG program. In fiscal year 2016, there were 161 rural grantees. So we've looked at the program minimum requirements for NFFS and ASC. We've looked at special designations, the program structure, and grants. Now we will discuss the calculation process. So we start with the full pool of available funds for radio, and in 2016 this was a little over $92 million. The RSG, the Rural Support Grants, are then determined. The base grants are taken out, and then the remaining funds are designated for incentive grants, and these are for the levels C and D stations. The incentive rate calculation is displayed here to determine the amount of each incentive grant. The incentive funds pool this year was almost $59 million. The incentive funds pool is divided by the total adjusted NFFS of eligible stations. Again, that's for levels C and D stations. And this gives us our incentive rate of return, or IRR. Each station's adjusted NFFS is multiplied by the IRR to get their final incentive grant. Essentially, stations eligible for incentive grants this year received about 5.8 cents for every adjusted NFFS dollar. So if you're interested in estimating your CSG for the next year, you can follow these general guidelines. So take the average of your last 3 base grants. This information can be found on cpb.org if you don't have that information available. For levels C and D, calculate your average, the average of the last 3 IRRs, and this is listed here. It's about 0.06, about 6 cents on the dollar. And then base grant modifications, if you're a mass station, multiply your base grant by 1.5. For the incentive grant, you'll have to do, again, a multiplication of your NFFS. For mass stations, it's 1.5. Rural stations, 1.25. And if you're both minority and rural designated, then you would multiply your NFFS by 1.75. Again, this would be for levels C and D stations. The rural support grants, this is a bit more tricky because it is heavily dependent on the number of rural stations in any given year and the number of those that are designated as minority stations. You may want to use the average of the last 3 years and be conservative in your estimate. For planning purposes, this will be an approximation of your CSG grant, but remember that the final numbers will, of course, be different. So the next slide gives you a summary of what we discussed. This does not include the rural support grant, but it would be included for all rural stations. So you'll see that the minimum NFFS is different for each level. The staff requirements are different as well. ASC requirements, they are for all stations except for level A. And your population, coverage area population density, you have to pay attention to as well. It's not the same for every level. Your base grants, of course, as you can see here on the second to the last column, they depend on your level, and only incentive grants are for levels C and D. So we've discussed NFFS and ASC requirements, special designations, CSG program and grant structure, and the grant calculation details. This concludes the radio-specific portion of this presentation, and Kate will now share some closing thoughts with you.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Okay, so you've got the overview of TV and radio, and we just wanted to leave you with a reminder that CPB provides significant resources at cpb.org. So if you'd like more information about the community service grant programs or eligibility criteria or general provisions, that is to say the terms and conditions of the grants that you receive, you could go to cpb.org. So if we go to the next slide, we also have email address. Someone is there at all times, well, 8 hours a day anyway. csg@cpb.org, and we will get back to you quickly. Also, the phone number you see there and the fax. Please avail yourselves of those if you have some questions for us beyond today. And on the next slide is some contact information for both Andrew and for me, so that you could contact us. In the meantime, though, we would like to know if you do refer to the general provisions and eligibility criteria that describe the terms and conditions of your grant award. Do you refer to those each year? If so, could you give us an idea of how often you do? We asked because each year they're updated, and each year they are what your head of grantee and licensee official certify when they receive their grant offer that your station is in compliance with. And so we'd like to know if you actually refer to it. That would be good information to have. Now, I think with that in mind and with our contact information provided to you, we have some time for questions, if, John, we have any.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Andrew. That was a really informative webinar. If any attendees have some questions, please go ahead and put those in the chat box, and we'll get some responses from Kate and Andrew. And we'll go ahead and get started. We have a couple of questions regarding the Communication Act requirement, mostly centered around, do committee meeting agendas and minutes have to be made public upon request, or do they need to be put up in advance, or what are the requirements around those committee meetings?
If you are conducting any business, that is any decision making related to your station in any meetings, you will want to have advance notice of those meetings so that people can get to them. In the interest of transparency, you would want to have those minutes available to stations, although the Communications Act does not specifically require that you maintain those minutes and make them available.
Great. Our next question, do you do individual reviews of criteria and station numbers?
I think the question being asked is, will we consult with stations to review whether the criteria is being met? If that's the question, yes, we do all the time. We are working with stations who call or email us with, they describe how they're meeting a certain eligibility requirement, and then they'll ask us, is this consistent with the guidance you provide? And that's what we do. CPB provides guidance based on the criteria and the terms of the grant that we have provided.
Great. We have one more question. As far as the fiscal year spending period, CPB only states that it starts October 1st of the grant year. This attendee is curious if that applies to expenses occurred on or after October 1st, or if invoices received on or after October 1st. For example, if they are paying for a program that begins airing in September and will continue to be aired after October 1, but the invoice is dated after October 1, can they pay the whole amount with FY16 monies, or should it be prorated between the two fiscal years?
Well, that's a good question. I'd be tempted to say it would be important to consult with the station's independent auditor, who will apportion spending, but what ideally our guidance is that you report only what is spent within a given year. So if you can apportion it over the course of 2 years, that would be the most accurate way to do it.
And remember, too, there's a difference between the PPB CSG fiscal year as well as your own fiscal year. So you'll be reporting potentially across your fiscal years on money that you could spend over the 2-year CSG grant period. So as Kate mentioned, you'll need to liaise with your accounting department to figure out the best way to report those expenses. But be aware that there are those two distinctions between fiscal years.
That's right. The spending period for each grant is 2 years. It begins October 1st of 1 year, and then on September 30th, 2 years later, is the end of the spending period. So you will cycle through probably 2 of your own fiscal years during that time. Most stations, I would dare to say, spend each grant within 1 year, but not all. Many stations do spend over the course of the 2-year spending period that is associated with each grant.
We've had a couple of more questions roll in. What is the matching of the...
So John,
sorry, go ahead.
I just want to go back to the previous question as well in terms of the CSG review of certification. So if there's anything related to the Communications Act requirements specifically, each station would have to consult their own legal counsel. CPB would not weigh in on the Communications Act requirements per se, as if they're, you would have to consult with your legal counsel. We don't give legal advice.
That's right. We don't
but we can, of course, help you find the right sources within our suite of available documents to help you speak with your legal team.
Yes, and our legal team here produces a certification document each year that updates how stations may comply with the Communications Act, and that is located on our website. So if you could look for the certification document on cpb.org, you'll get a lot of detail regarding how stations can comply with the Communications Act.
Follow-up question for the Communications Act. If all subcommittee meetings take place directly after the CAB meetings, do stations need to post a separate announcement for those subcommittee meetings?
I don't think you would, as long as you, they'd have to, if you adjourn your full board meeting, if you adjourn it, then you essentially have multiple meetings. So yes, you would in that case. But if you adjourn your full meeting after the subcommittees meet, I think you'd be all right posting one notice.
Another different question. What is the matching of the CSG grant for NFFS for radio for FY15? How many cents to the dollar?
So for stations that receive an incentive grant, it's about 5.8 cents per NFFS dollar earned. Oh, for FY, did you say FY15 or FY16?
The question is for FY15.
FY15, it was a little over 6 cents, I believe, for FY15.
And then I think we just have one more follow-up to the CAB meeting. If you have an executive session that is closed at the end of each board meeting, do you need to post that information for each meeting? And do you need to post the reasons for that meeting each time?
In the interest of transparency, it's advisable to do so. And if you're going to have one at the end of each CAB meeting, you should just routinely put it on your agenda and make a note that in your that there is an executive session included in each. Because remember, if you don't announce that you have an executive session coming up, you will need to post shortly after you hold a closed session the purpose for that session. And yes, it would be advisable to include, even if you give it advance notice, the purpose for the session. So it might be personnel discussion, it might be contract discussion, or whatever it is.
Great. That's it for all of the questions from the attendees. Andrew, Kate, I'd like to thank you again for spending some time with us this afternoon to talk about the community service grants. And I'd also like to thank all of the attendees for participating this afternoon. Please be on the lookout in your inboxes for an evaluation sent by PMBA on this toolkit. And if you have any suggestions or ideas that you would like to see for future PMBA toolkits, please email those to info@pmbaonline.org. And thank you again, and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, John. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.